I'm Karen Ryder, owner and lead trainer of Tara the Hound Dog Training Services, and welcome to the Control Unleashed class. What we'll be covering tonight is a few topics relevant to the Control Unleashed class that you need to know before starting this program. The first topic we will be talking about is thresholds. Now we need to understand that all living creatures have thresholds, everything from ants to elephants, you and me. And what we want to think of as a threshold is we want to think of it as like a line in the sand or the air. And anything below threshold, the individual is calm, relaxed, open to learning. Everything is right with the world. As they start to creep towards this threshold line, they may look normal to the outside world, but they start to feel a little tight, a little uncomfortable about what's going on around them. And as they cross over the threshold line, they become almost panicked, depending upon how far over they go, to where they're no longer able to think clearly. All they want to do is get out of that situation. They're in survival mode. They just want to escape whatever it is that's causing them to go over threshold. When you're over threshold, basically you can no longer think clearly. You can't really eat. You're not interested in food. And your brain chemistry is such where your brain is now getting flooded with a lot of stress hormones, cortisol, epinephrine, endorphins, that sort of thing, where you're really at that point, you just want to get out of that situation. So when our dogs are over threshold and we're trying to give them a treat to make it better and they're not eating, it's not that they're not interested in food or not motivated by food. At that point, they just want to get out of that situation. It's kind of like if I plopped you down into the ghettos of Detroit at 3 o'clock in the morning and there were multiple individuals chasing us or following us with knives or whatever, and you were walking along, and every time you went to look at them, I kind of nudged and said, don't worry about that. Here, you want to eat a cupcake? You'd probably go, no, I don't want to eat a cupcake. Let's just get out of here. Or in that situation, if I ask you to do math, well, you might be very good at math at any other time, but because you're stressed about your surroundings and about those people following you, you're probably not going to even be able to do simple math. And it's the same thing for our dogs, that when they're over threshold, they may not be able to eat. They may not be able to comply to simple requests that we know they know very well. And it's not that they're being belligerent or stubborn or dominant. It is because they physically, psychologically cannot think through, because their brain at that point is just thinking about getting out of that situation and surviving. So you're going to hear us talk about a lot in this class, your dog is going over threshold. And when your dog is over threshold, no real training or learning can take place. So what you have to do is you got to just get the dog out of that situation at that point. You just want to remove them away until they can start becoming back down to threshold, below threshold, so they can think a little bit better. The other thing you need to be aware of is that every time your dog goes over threshold and the brain is flooded with these stress hormones, it may take anywhere from 30 minutes to 30 days, depending upon how far over they've gone and how many times they are going over threshold in their life, for their brain to come back down to a normal state. So every time they go over threshold, if they're going over threshold multiple times a day, that may take days for their brain chemistry to get back to normal. So the dogs that are sitting on the back of the couch shrieking their heads off at people walking by day in and day out, what happens is their poor brain doesn't get a chance to come back to its normal state, and what happens is the threshold line drops, and now these dogs, every little thing will send them over threshold. Somebody's talking outside, somebody closes a car door, they hear a knocking in 3 apartments down, and they're just barking their heads off, because everything now sends them over threshold, because their brain chemistry is such that it's become their new normal, and the threshold level has dropped. So what we're trying to do in this class is we're trying to raise the threshold level up. So it takes a lot more to get them to go over threshold, so they're much more resilient to their world. The other thing we're going to talk about in this class is trigger stacking. A trigger is anything that causes your dog to start going over thresholds. And there again, we all have triggers. So for a dog, it may be another unknown dog. It may be a kid on a skateboard. It may be a noise, the vacuum cleaner. Anything can be a trigger for your dog. Same thing with us. We all have triggers. And a good analogy for the trigger stacking that I use is, let's say you have a big presentation tomorrow, and you've worked really hard on this project, and the night before you're getting everything around and you're making sure everything is ready to go, so you don't have to hunt for anything, and you set the alarm so you can get up early, and let's say your alarm didn't go up and now you're running a little late, and you're racing around and you stub your toe and you're like, oh my god, and you go, fine, and you rush into the shower and there's no hot water and you're like, oh my god, and you get into the car and you feel like, oh, I forgot to put gas in this car. So by the time you get to work, now you're running a little late. Your boss makes some snide remark to you and you're like, phew. And you may look okay to the outside world, but you're really starting to go over threshold. And let's say you do your presentation, everything's fine, you're calming down, you get home, and your husband goes, did you remember the milk? And you're like, no. And normally your spouse asking whether you remember the milk is not going to trigger you into a reaction. But because things had stacked up over that day, that one trigger, which by itself wouldn't have been enough to make a noticeable difference, set you off, and now you had a reaction. And it's the same with our dogs. And triggers can stack up over hours, days, weeks, to the point where I hear people say, well, this dog bit out of the blue. Well, did he? Or did he have some trigger stacking going on, and he might have seemed fine with a neighbor kid because the trigger stacked up and that kid was the last straw, boom, he got bit. So we need to be really aware about what our dog's triggers are and how they're stacking up over time, and really look back on an incident and say, why did that happen? So we can't assume because a dog was fine yesterday with something that he'll be fine with it today. So that kind of brings us to the management. We need to manage these dogs in such a way that we keep them safe. And it's their definition of safety, not ours. So if we have a dog that is worried about strangers coming into the house, well, we certainly wouldn't have him loose where he can rush up to people coming in through the doorway, barking and jumping on them and that sort of thing, because he's over threshold in that situation. So what we would do is we would not allow him to have access to people coming into the door. We would teach him some new coping skills, which you will learn in this class, and then we will slowly add people coming into the door until he can receive guests coming to the home without feeling threatened by them. Same with, if he's very reactive to other dogs, you might not walk him down a busy street during a busy part of a day where everybody else is walking their dogs. You might not take him to the dog park. You might put him in the car and walk him in a quieter park somewhere. So management is about keeping your dog safe so he doesn't get to practice the behaviors that send him over threshold, or he doesn't have access to his triggers that are sending him over threshold. So you see it a lot, little dogs sit on the back of the couch and they shriek their heads off at people who pass by all day long. Well, there again, I wouldn't allow my dog to have access to that window where he can see passerbys if passerbys are triggers. I would either block his access to that room, or I would cover the window where he couldn't see out. So we really have to think about how we can keep these dogs safe while we're teaching them the new coping skills, and then slowly adding the triggers back in so they can rehearse better behaviors, more appropriate behaviors, and get them where they aren't feeling stressed by their triggers coming in and out of their lives. So when we go through this control and leash class, we're going to constantly be thinking about thresholds, triggers, and how do we manage our dogs in such a way that they can get it right, and they can do it in such a way where they're not rehearsing behaviors that aren't good for them or those around them.